Okay. I'm going to continue to use the same opening prayer until we take a break around Memorial Day, and the same closing prayer, and then I'll pick a new set for our return in the fall. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Loving God, you fill all things with a fullness and hope that we can never comprehend. Thank you for leading us into a time where more of reality is being unveiled for all of us to see. We pray that you will take away our natural temptation for cynicism, denial, fear, and despair. Help us have the courage to awaken to the greater truth, greater humility, and greater care for one another. May we place our hope in what matters and what lasts, trusting in your eternal presence and love. Listen to our heart's longing for the healing of our suffering world. Knowing, good God, that you are hearing us better than we are speaking, we offer these prayers in all the holy names of God. Amen. This morning, we are launching out into a new conversation. We have been talking about John, which is the last gospel written. And now we're going to talk about Mark, which is the first gospel written. Paul's letters, of course, preceded the first gospel, but Mark is the first gospel. I've chosen Mark and John because we are in year B of our liturgical year. So the readings at our Sunday services are taken largely from the Gospel of Mark, with the Gospel of John being used in certain feast days, particularly around Lent and Easter. Now, year B has more selections from the Gospel of John than other liturgical years, so this seemed to be a good time to do all of that. We went through Bruno Barnhart's book about the Gospel of John, which is largely rooted in the wisdom tradition and sapiential theology and mysticism. Those are all kind of cognates for the idea of the interior life and the heart, and how that contemplative tradition of our faith might find roots in the Gospel of John, and how our looking at it might help us to think about and practice the growth of our own heart, our own interior life. But action leads to contemplation, as we say. And so it's kind of interesting now to turn to the first gospel written, which was of Mark, and look at Mark not through the same lens, not as if we were looking for its contemplative dimensions, but instead to look at it through a political lens and look at its socio-political dimensions. And they are really there. It's not a matter of finding what you look for, I think. It's a matter of looking for a specific thing and seeing how prominently it's presented. More prominently, I think, than I certainly realized before I started studying it from this perspective, and I hope more than you have realized. But it's a nice complement, I think, to the contemplative work we've done with the Gospel of John, to turn to the political work which is being done by the Gospel of Mark. To start, I'd like to offer a historical context for the Gospel, because I think that sets the stage for the politics that you're going to see there. Now, when I say politics, I don't just mean the two-party battle over control of our representative democracy in the United States right now, right? When I say politics, I mean a more broader definition of the term, which really might be translated as the art of living together. The art of living together is what politics is. Out of that, we choose a governmental structure, we choose a social organization, but politics, as I'm going to use the term, is a broader term than just what we might think of as our electoral politics in this country. Historical context. The Gospel of Mark was written for the Christian community in Rome at about the middle of the century. Now, Rome in, let's just say, the mid-60s was the place to be. It was the power center of the Mediterranean world. It probably had about 2 million people, which is a lot, as you can imagine. And about 30 or 40,000 of those, about 2%, were probably Jews. Now, the Jews who lived there experienced a cycle of violence, for lack of a better term, in which they went through this period of peace, often followed by some kind of problem, which resulted in their eviction, and after a period of time, their return. This cycle repeated itself, much as it might have, you might see that same cycle in the history of the nation of Israel with the various exiles. But it was true for this community in Rome. There were evictions, for example, as far back as 139 BCE, and 19 in the Common Era, and 49 in the Common Era. So there's just an example of 3 evictions which spanned what was more than 200 years. Now, Claudius becomes emperor in the year 41, and he, in an effort to get control of the Jewish population, which lived fundamentally in a Jewish ghetto. There were the hills of Rome where the aristocracy lived. And then across the river, there was some marshy territory where the Jewish community lived, where the Jewish ghetto was. Now, in that section of town, sometimes referred to as the Jewish quarter, in the year 49, there were some disturbances, which, as I mentioned before, led to an expulsion. There is some thought that what was happening in the quarter causing that disturbance was the increasing tension between the Messianic Jews, those Jews, they self-identified as Jews, who were followers of Christ or Christus, and Jews who were not. That this division was already causing tension, and that was creating problems in the Jewish quarter. But then in 54, Nero, whom I know you have heard, becomes emperor, and he allows the Jews to return. And Peter and Paul come with him. Now, Peter and Paul, who we've discussed at length over the last couple of years, very different personalities, very different roles in the development of the early church. They didn't always get along with each other. And here they were in Rome at the same time. Peter probably comes in the 40s, so he would have been evicted in 49 and returned in 54. But Paul probably comes later in the year 55, or maybe as late as the year 60. Peter is living in the Jewish quarter, and Paul, because he is a Roman citizen, is under house arrest. He actually didn't come to Rome voluntarily. He was brought there for trial, and he sat in house arrest for a long period of time awaiting that trial. And then, well, the one thing I want to note is that despite the differences between these two characters and their own disputes with each other, in a real, I think, peak of irony, we celebrate their feast day together. So on June the 29th, we celebrate the feast of Peter and Paul, as if they were wonderful buddies who walked hand in hand in the growth of Christianity throughout the first century. I love to preach on those feast days because you just get to play with the tensions of the early church and how little people actually agreed with each other about what was happening, which always makes me feel better about whatever is happening on that day in our own country. But Peter, as you may remember, is a fisherman from Galilee. He knew Jesus personally. He was a leader of the Messianic Jews, and he didn't write very much. There are 2 letters in the New Testament, which are maybe from Peter, but probably simply written by his followers in his name. And he is described by tradition as gentle and accepting. This is intriguing, right? We're always thinking of him as impulsive and perhaps ascribing other personality traits to him because of his impulsiveness. But tradition, for whatever reason, has described him as gentle and accepting, which, of course, marks a sharp contrast with Paul. Paul is a scholar and an orator. He is born in Turkey, highly educated, and a Roman citizen. He did not know Jesus personally. He knew the Christ who appeared to him in a vision. And his first letters probably date around 45, and they continue, of course, up until his death, but they all precede the writing of Mark, the first gospel. Paul, tradition holds, is feisty, both in heart and in tongue. So both of these two characters, prominent in the development of the church, are there in Rome at the same time. And then on July 19th, in the year 64, a fire broke out in Rome, and the blaze went on for 5 days, burning almost all of the city. They finally got it out, and then it ignited again and burned for another 48 hours. This was a huge fire which wreaked devastating destruction. But it didn't really touch the Jewish quarter. And the reason it didn't touch is because they're across the river Tiber, of course, separated from the other parts of the city. But Nero became the subject of some real scrutiny after this fire. There were rumors that he had burned the city, which is where our image of Nero fiddling while the Rome burns, because he really was trying to rebuild the city in a classical image, and it might have accelerated his building projects if the rest of those annoying buildings could simply be destroyed. So it wasn't long before people started looking for ways to attack Nero. And as we so often do when we think we are threatened, it didn't take long for Nero to find a scapegoat. And his scapegoat were the Jews. People blamed the fire on Nero. Nero turned around and blamed it on the Jews, holding up as his primary piece of evidence that the fire didn't touch the Jewish quarter, didn't touch the ghetto. Now, Jews had only been back in Rome for about 10 years when this all happened, and there was apparently great fear that the persecution of Nero would be brutal. So there's some tradition claims that somebody out of the Jewish quarter went to Nero and said, in fact, it was the Jews, but not all the Jews, just the Messianic Jews, just those followers of Jesus. They were the ones who burned Rome. There's no evidence that they actually did, of course, but that was enough to trigger Nero's response, which was to force the Jewish community to cooperate with the Roman soldiers in persecuting the Messianic Jews. And they did. So the Romans repeatedly went from house to house, and they would knock on the door. And if you were a believer, you were to confess that you were a believer. If you didn't say anything at all or denied it, you had two choices. Either one, you could name somebody else who was a believer, or they would simply take you anyway. And they took everyone who was pointed out as a believer or confessed to being a believer to the Circus Maximus, and there they brutally executed them in a very public way. Now, some people think the Circus Maximus was over on the other side of the river Tiber from the city itself, but most historians believe that it was actually where St. Peter's Basilica is today. So the next time you visit St. Peter's Basilica or see televised ceremonies of great grandeur, you can remember that it is also the site of these brutal executions. I just want to pause here to make the comparison between the scapegoating and execution of the Messianic Jews here and what I have claimed before is a scapegoating and execution of Christ, right? That you're at a time of great uproar and upset and fear and anxiety, and that the way that anxiety is calmed is by the identification of a scapegoat who's deemed to be responsible, though generally it's really plausible that they did the thing you're afraid of. What is real is that they can't defend themselves and they're somehow different from everybody else. So there is in Jesus's crucifixion that famous conversation between the high priest and Pontius Pilate at the end, who said, It says they were friends for the first time. And here you have, by tradition, the Jews in the ghetto deciding better to name these individuals and allow them to be scapegoated by Nero, than to have the complete elimination of the community itself. So a lot of similarities there. And it would not be far-fetched, I think, to believe that the Messianic Jews saw themselves as literally the body of Christ in that moment, being persecuted and killed in the same way that Christ was killed, perhaps giving them some greater insight or at least perspective on what the crucifixion might have actually meant. Now, the other thing I told you a minute ago is that Peter and Paul were both there. Well, tradition has it that Peter actually escaped this persecution, that he got out of the city safely. And then while he was in safety, he had his own vision. And Jesus appeared to him and said, "Peter, where are you going? Peter, where are you going?" Kind of Peter's own version of the appearance of Paul to Paul, right? And so Peter turns around and goes back to the city, where he is immediately arrested and killed. Tradition has it that he would not allow himself to be crucified upright, that he was instead hung upside down on a post or a cross, and that is how he died. I want to, just because it's in my mind, just draw the connection here between Peter and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. We have studied Bonhoeffer in the past. Bonhoeffer escapes the Nazi regime, who is engaging in its own scapegoating, right, in order to consolidate its power. And he gets to Union Seminary, where he's given a tenured position and has a perfectly safe place to wait out the war before returning home. He has his own kind of vision and decides that he can't be away. And he gets on a steamer and he goes back to Germany. And of course, there he is ultimately hung for his role in the conspiracy to kill Hitler, the bomb under Hitler's desk that didn't actually kill him. So I point these two references out only to say there are patterns here that are interesting, and they are patterns which tend to repeat themselves in history. They don't always look exactly the same, but if you know what to look for, you can find them. And Scripture tends to give us meanings to associate with those patterns. So when you find them, you can look for the same meanings there. This allows us as believers, as Christians, to see things we might not otherwise see, or to be more theological about it, to identify the presence of God where you might have otherwise missed it. The expanded consciousness that we think we gain allows us to see more, and that more includes the presence of God, which allows us to act in accordance with the will of God. That's our fundamental ethical guide. Or as I said this morning at 7:45 in my sermon, we learn more deeply to act out of love and into love. Act out of the love that we have received from God and into the love that God calls us to. Wherever two or three are gathered together, Jesus says, I will be present. It's a fundamentally communal look at faith and God. So to the extent you thought the Gospel of John had a real sense of privacy to it, as it focused on our interior life, I want to show you how the Gospel of Mark has a real sense of community to it, as we look at the external behavior that our faith lead us to, the public professing of our faith. Okay, so this historical context leaves us with the Christian community, which of course wouldn't call itself Christian for another 150 years, but the Messianic Jews who were there in Rome in the 60s in an environment of terror and shame and abandonment and death. You can only begin to imagine who was reading or listening to the Gospel of Mark when it was composed. or to think about the world into which the writer of the Gospel of Mark wrote. Now, one way we've looked at the Gospel of Mark before is to say that it is a way of looking at the question, how do we move through suffering? Remember that? How do we move through suffering? And with this historical context, hopefully you can see why that's a necessary thing. But I also think the Gospel of Mark provides astute political commentary on the structures of power that are causing the suffering. It looks at the structures of power that are causing the suffering, much like Walter Wink in his series on engaging the powers or naming the powers. I know some of you have studied those works. Mark is right there, looking at the way we have organized our society, looking at the way that evil plays itself out in those socio-political structures of power. And he's doing it from the margin. He's doing it from the bottom. He is doing it from the perspective of the victim, of the one who's suffering. So that perspective is the one I want us to take. It's not all Mark has to say. This is not just a political manifesto, but it is part and a meaningful, crucial, unique part of what the Gospel of Mark has to say. So that's why I want to study it from this perspective. So, for example, let me give you just a couple of examples from the Gospel that I hope will bear out what I'm claiming here. Mark's narration of Jesus' healing in the leper towards the end of the first chapter, Mark 1, 40 to 45. We often think of that as a healing story. And on its face, it looks like it's just a healing story. But I think to look at Mark through a political lens, from the one who is suffering to the structures of power, you might see that it is also a condemnation of the priestly aristocracy's callous exclusion of lepers. It's not just a healing, it's a bringing back of an excluded class of people into the community that are deemed by the priest to be worthy of gathering together, of being together, of qualifying as part of the protected group. Do you see that? That is a political judgment rendered by the religious authorities. So it's not just Mark looking at lepers and saying, or Jesus looking at lepers and saying, I'm going to heal you because you're suffering from this terrible disease. It is, in fact, Jesus challenging the political authority of the religious establishment in rejoining these unclean people to the community. They're deemed unclean by the priests, right? They're excluded by the priests. It is the political and social power of the religious institution which is deeming them to be on the margins. And that's what Jesus is challenging. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? Okay. The second example would be the widow's mite, which occurs in the 13th chapter of Mark, verses 41 to 44. Now, one way to look at that is to see the faith of this poor woman who gives her last bit of wealth to God. And that's true. But another way to look at that through the political lens is a challenge to the ideological hegemony of the Jerusalem temple authorities, who had used their privilege and power, and they had privilege and power, to extract the last bit of wealth from this poor woman. Very different. The woman is still the focus of our empathy, our compassion, and the theological claims of the story. But a very different claim to think that it's just about her faith than to think that it's about a condemnation of the religious authorities, whose religion is having an economic impact on the poor. You with me? Another individual who's on the margins. Their suffering is in part caused by the privileged, by the people who are holding power. So to look at that story through a political lens is to look at the unjustness of the social, political power structure. Does that make sense? To look at it as a faith story leaves the power structure completely unexamined and out of the picture. As if the status quo was fine, we should in fact simply focus on the extreme faith of this poor woman. So very different ways to look at the gospel, very different patterns of human behavior, very different meanings. Now, which one do you think made the most sense to that Messianic Jewish community in Rome after the persecution in the mid-60s? Okay. Third example, Mark's description of the Gerasene demoniac, right? We often look at that story as Jesus confronting the demons and banishing them, the power of good over evil. But what if we looked at the Gerasene demoniac as not someone suffering from some psychological illness or the possession of demons alone, but as a figure representing a community of people who were being oppressed, excluded, and whose self-hating was a function of that exclusion and oppression. We've seen that kind of psychological impact on oppressed people throughout history, where their own sense of themselves is destroyed by the oppression that they suffer. What if that's what they saw in the Gerasene demoniac? How would that change your understanding of the ministry and message of Jesus? How would that change your sense of what good news actually meant? Right? What does good news mean to the Messianic Jewish community in the ghetto of the Jewish quarter of Rome in the 60s? These three examples, I think, are representative, but they're not alone. And again, my claim is not that Mark is a political manifesto solely for use by a political class. My point is that Jesus's proclamation of love has real grit in Mark, and that it is best understood when seen through the eyes of those on the margin, those who are victimized, those who are trampled upon and persecuted, right? That we cannot understand Mark fully until we can find ourselves empathetic enough and compassionate enough to take that perspective. And it is trying to put ourselves, however ineffectively we may be, into their shoes, which I think gives us the broadest, deepest, most meaningful understanding of the good news of Jesus as proclaimed by Mark. And to do that, I'm going to use a commentary that's titled Say to the Mountain. You can, of course, find it in the Cathedral Bookstore because everything worth reading is available through the Cathedral Bookstore. The email that you received this week from me and that you will receive next week as well will give you the title. But if you'd like to write it down now, it's Say to the Mountain by Ched, C-H-E-D, Myers, M-E-Y-E-R-S. And the subtitle I've adopted for the title of our series, it's Mark's Story of Discipleship. If you look back at your email, you'll see this listed. If you go to the website of the Cathedral Bookstore, you'll see it highlighted. And if all of that fails, you have my email address and you should email me and ask. And if you can't find a copy, I'll send you a copy. We'll start, there are about, as far as I can map this out, there are about 25 classes in this series. So we won't have 25 classes between now and the beginning of year C, but we will probably break for the summer and then come back with the Gospel of Mark if it feels like we've got good energy, and finish it up when Advent starts, on the Sunday before First Advent. So I invite you to get a copy of the Gospel of Mark and read it. I invite you to, if you'd like to probe deeper, get a copy of this commentary. You can see, unlike the other books I recommend to you, it is not thick. And unlike the other books I often recommend to you, it's not hard. So you might enjoy reading it more than you enjoyed reading some of the other books I've recommended to you. Nevertheless, It's new, I think, in its freshness. And the original commentary, of which this is a accessible version, was back in the 80s, I think. This was probably published in the late 90s. So it's not new as in yesterday, but it's new in its freshness, I think, at least for me, and I hope for us. So I want to stop there and see if you have any questions or comments or thoughts about this take on the Gospel of Mark. Have you ever heard it before?
Morning, George. This is Ian. Just a question about the textbook. A month or so ago, you had said to us that you'd be using Binding the Strong Man. I'm about halfway through it, thoroughly enjoying it. Just wondering what the difference is between Binding the Strong Man and the Say to the Mountain.
So poor Ian got my early recommendation, which was Binding the Strong Man, also by Chad Myers. It's a little bit thicker than the one I've recommended to you. It's a little bit more technical. And so if you'd like to read that one, that is great. The difference is, Ian, that after Myers published this Binding the Strong Man, which takes this socio-political, socio-historical perspective, and that was, back in 1988, people felt that it wasn't as accessible to the lay person as they wanted it to be. So he got together with a number of other writers, and they came up with this second commentary, which is the same thing, simply done in more accessible terms and laid out as a workbook. You'll see their exercises there and reflections and epilogues that don't exist in Binding the Strong Man. So I think the work you have done in reading Binding the Strong Man is going to serve you well. It's good stuff. That's my preferred book, but I'm recommending the second because I think it's more accessible.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense, George, and particularly his lengthy introduction on his hermeneutical method. Now, I love all that stuff, but it does get pretty technical, and if you're not into that, you probably actually not get to the commentary before you fall asleep.
Yes, exactly. Not a great thing for a Sunday school class.
No. All right, great. Thanks, George.
But one that's been imposed on you before. But yes, Ian, that's it. Thank you. What's your favorite story from the Gospel of Mark? Great. That means I get to tell you whatever I want to tell you about the gospel as we go through. No. So what I'd like for you to do for next week's class is read what amounts to the prologue, which is Mark 1, chapter 1, verses 1 to 20. And pay attention to the structure of that passage, that prologue. See if you can divide it into the different episodes. There's 6 different episodes there. I don't think the transitions between them are terribly difficult to do. But if you do that, you will begin to see that, like John, though not as complicated as John, Mark has his own structure in how he writes. And that structure does communicate some of his meaning, I think. This one is chronologically laid out, and it's not anything like that cruciform structure we examined in John, but the juxtaposition of stories will make a difference. Like where the story of the widow's mite occurs, for example, does give you a clue of what Mark wants us to make out of that. So look at the episodes of that prologue. What else are you hoping to learn from our time with the gospel?
George, this is Ian again. I've always been very interested in liberation theology. Back in my grad school days, I read a lot of Guterres and the Latin American guys. What I found interesting in starting to work with Myers is how he's taking Mark's gospel and really using it as a liberation theology lens to look at the Western world, the United States in particular, but the power structures of the developed world as a whole, or the imperialistic world, as Myers likes to call it. So that's what I'm excited about, looking forward to, is just a liberation theology that is more geared for the world that we live in, rather than the Latin American world that the original liberation theologians were writing.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. And could you give us a brief definition of liberation theology?
Well, I've always sort of seen it as this challenging, kind of like you said in your introduction, challenging of the political and power structures in the broad sense. And in the Latin American context, of course, it was very much the priests of the Catholic Church, people like, the El Salvadorian bishop, archbishop, who was assassinated back in the late 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And their concern was that the hierarchy or the institution of the church was really married with the dictatorships and the power structures of the political arena, and also all mixed up with the drug cartels and so forth. And there was this oppression of the ordinary lay people and parishioners. And it was seeing that the liberation message in the gospel, such as the example you gave of the Gadarene demoniac, that it's more than just, here's someone being set free from demons, but what was the name of the demon? Legion. Well, Legion, of course, when Mark's writing, that is code word for the whole political oppressive system. So,
well, not yet. And to be more specific, thank you, Ian. And to be more specific, what the Roman army called its unit, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's, so of course, liberation theology got very controversial in the 60s and 70s, because most of the scholars involved were heavily influenced by Marxism. And so certainly to a lot of the North American mind, that immediately meant, oh, well, we reject liberation theology per se because of its Marxist undertones. But that's throwing the baby out with the bathwater, in my opinion. I think Marx did have some very valid critique, as well as has some stuff that was completely off the wall. So that's kind of my little 101 of liberation theology.
No, I think that's excellent. And I want to underscore one thing that you said, again, to pull it completely out of all of that and go back to Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer's belief that the purpose of the church was to critique power, right? Not that power is evil in itself, but to critique power in order to constantly be furthering the kingdom, or the sovereignty of God, if you will. And he saw that as part of the purpose of the church. So it didn't matter the political party, and it didn't matter the political organizational structure of the government, and it didn't matter what ideology you had adopted, in whatever imperfect way you have adopted it. The purpose of the church was to constantly look at the power and presence of God and critique the power to the extent that it didn't further life for all, right? In our baptismal covenant, we talk about respecting the dignity of every human being, and doing that means paying attention to whether the structures of power are giving life or taking life, right? It's
George?
the same thing that Beatrice Brutto is doing when she's interpreting the Holy Thursday Revolution. The foot washing in the Gospel of John is a movement from a domination paradigm to a friendship paradigm. All of those are ways of critiquing power that is taking life from rather than giving life to others. So the purpose of this course is not to come out on the other side endorsing a particular embodiment of power or endorsing a particular way of organizing society or endorsing a particular kind of government. The purpose is to look at how power operates, see patterns in how it operates and takes life from people, and then look for them in our current political environment. So Ian's exactly right about that, looking at how it plays itself out today. And then, of course, we'll be called upon by our conscience and by our church and by our God to decide how we're going to respond to that, right? But what I want to do is try to give you some tools for the analytical work, right? To give you tools for recognizing those patterns. And I think Mark does that. And as Ian has noted, Myers is falling into a long line of folks who have done that, from Bonhoeffer to the liberation theologians.
Yeah, George,
Yes.
one aside on the liberation theology. In the 70s, I guess, there was a canon at the cathedral who had I think his wife's from Latin America, and there were several Sunday school classes about it. And of course, I'm glad I didn't have to give the summary of it, what it was, but wasn't it in general that the church had always supported the powers that be, and the elites to the detriment of the people? But anyway, it was an interesting series.
Yeah, I bet. Well, of course, I mean, to bring this home, what is the current critique about mainstream Christianity? That we were so involved in supporting the power structure of society and its social and cultural embodiment during the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, that now that we're not kind of given privileged position by mainstream society anymore, we've lost our relevance. Right? You see the similarity between that faith that we now find ourselves in and the more horrendous place the church found itself in South America. And you can go back through history where the great challenge to the church has been, how does it exist beside the empire? It might have worked for us when Constantine said we were part of it all. Maybe it didn't work. I don't know. It's an interesting question, but I think that's been a challenge for the church ever since. And of course, we now in the West live in a place where church and state are deemed to be separate. As I like to say, that's to protect the church from the state, not to protect the state from the church, right? The separation of church and state is to protect the church from the state, not to protect the state from the church. But that hadn't existed through most of history. They've been all bound up together. And as Ian noted, there are folks who've come along and suggested that is really obscured and tainted and twisted the message of Jesus.
As you said, like so many things, it's another country. That's what they're doing. We never don't think that we might be doing that.
Right, right. You remember back when we were talking about just generally the contemplative kind of look at things, I offered you a model of wake up, grow up, clean up, show up. Do you remember that? Which comes from Ken Wilber, but I stole it without shame. And part of what we're talking about here is the cleanup part. I mean, it is a wake up and it is a grow up, but it's also a cleanup. You can't critique those patterns without acknowledging our inheritance from them and telling the truth about that, which doesn't have to derail us forever or make us bad people necessarily, but we can't move forward without telling the truth about the past, I think. And then showing up would be doing that, right? Would be doing that. We're coming to the end of our time. My purpose today was to kind of give you a sense of purpose around all of this, which I hope will be enticing and not anxiety creating for you. But I am wondering if you've got other thoughts you want to share around or questions that you have about all of this.
So, George, I'm wondering why, and maybe you can answer this, that Mark's gospel, being the only one that leaves out the birth story or the origins, and why his audience that he was writing to in Rome would not have been interested in that, or would not have been important to his storytelling.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? So, you know, every bone in my body wants to ask you what you think about that, but I won't, since you were gracious enough to ask a question. I mean, I don't know, but I think that there is a sense that Mark's gospel brings the gospel down to earth and tends to focus on things that might have been of immediate concern to that community then. There's some suggestion elsewhere that the whole idea of the virgin birth didn't come up until later, you know, kind of didn't gain real traction until later, but I don't know that. Yeah, I don't know. Anybody else want to try to answer that question? Okay. I'll try to get a better answer for you before next time. All right. Seeing no other objections, I'm going to close us in prayer. And I've inverted the prayers that we use. I know some of you know that, and I've done that on purpose. So I'm going to end with the prayer that we normally start with. Let us pray. Days pass and years vanish, and we walk sightless among miracles. Lord, fill our eyes with seeing and our minds with knowing. Let there be moments when your presence, like lightning, illumines the darkness in which we walk. Help us to see wherever we gaze that the bush burns unconsumed. And we, clay touched by God, will reach out for holiness and exclaim in wonder, how filled with awe is this place, and we did not know it. How filled with awe is this place, and we did not know it. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. See you on Sunday.
Thank you.
Thank you, George.
Thank you.
Thank you, George.
You're welcome. Thank you, Ian.
You're welcome. Bye.
Bye-bye.
George, I'll try to be better prepared next week than I was this week.
No worries, Charles.
This week,
I know your mind is working, and I know that it's going to come out next week.
yes, I
hope all this turns out to be fun. I love that Carolina pennant in the background. I just got
1950, got the pin in 55.
there. You have it. Have a good week.
Thank you.
Bye, Gene.